Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavai Tejasvinavaditamastu Avidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman protect us, may he guide us and give us strength and right understanding. May love and harmony be with us all. Om peace, peace, peace. And good evening. We're continuing to read from the complete works of Swami Ramakrishnananda. And last week we concluded the sections on Krishna, the Kingmaker. And then we read a couple of short sections on God, and now we're going to read another section on God called God Everywhere. It'd be interesting if they told us exactly what the origin of these little pieces were, but he must have written them for a magazine or something, because they're not long enough for lectures, so it must have been something else. A man who realizes God will have to be realizing him throughout eternity. No power can make him, the little him, the person, forget him, the big H, God. Too many pronouns in one sentence. Every portion of the universe is bristling with omniscience. To an ordinary man, this appears to be a dead, soulless universe. But that man who has the inner eye opened can see that this whole universe is palpitating with life because it is God's body. So that it reminds me of course, Sri Ramakrishna, who said he saw everything is like pillows of consciousness. And Fechner said that after his experience, he saw everything as besouled, rather than as not a soulless universe, but everything had a soul, according to him. Of course, that was his Christian language for it, and consciousness was Ramakrishna's language for it. And the various mystics tend to have their own way of putting it, but this is usually the kind of thing that they report, is that they begin to see everything as viewed with some sort of power or energy or God consciousness or something of that nature. In India, nature is to us our mother, our father, our friend and companion. So, of course, those are all the different relationships you can try to cultivate with an aspect of God. We have been able to commune with this nature, this is a capital N, nature, as our own mother, and so we boldly give out that the whole universe is living. Those poor Western thinkers think that when a nation is in a baby condition, it has a tendency to personify everything, just as a baby sees a leaf flying in the wind and takes it to be living, saying, "No, no, leaf, you must not move like that. Keep still." And that is the reason why in the Vedic period they saw mountains, rivers, etc. as living entities. But this is a great blunder on their part. A baby is very pure, and for that reason it has some insights into the workings of nature. A Paramahamsa, a great soul, has also been compared to a baby. But while a baby, through its ignorance, sees everything as living, the Paramahamsa sees everything as living through his wisdom. Having thus found out that everything is God, the wise men have given this good news to people who have not the power to see God for themselves. But ordinary people cannot grasp this idea easily. It is too difficult for them. This idea of the Supreme Lord exists everywhere. So God has been broken up piecemeal, as it were, but not really broken up. As a man looking at you from the outside does not confound his eyes with your ears, or your ears with your nose, so this one God is broken up into many forms of deity, through which the ignorant man may reach the one God, and each one may choose that one which is best suited to him. Of course, this is the standard kind of religions that we find throughout the world, especially in the earlier days of where the very various forces of nature are personified. And so the deities are personified, the sun's personified. That's usually the first thing that's personified, is the sun, and then the moon, and then the planets, and the mountains. We have sacred mountains and sacred rivers, and then the powers of nature like rain and thunder and wind, and all of those things are given names and thought of as various aspects or deities. And of course, this is because they are manifestations of energy. And just as he says, we have various sense organs that are different, but we don't confound them, and yet they're still just parts of us. And so similarly, all these energies are just really different manifestations of God. If you think of Brahman as somehow similar to energy in the physical universe, then we can see that since E equals mc squared and everything is energy, that everything is Brahman. And then that Brahman manifests in all these different forms. And it manifests as all the different kinds of energies, and then the energies get solidified into various forms. And so you've got everything literally made out of Brahman in that particular scientific viewpoint. So really, if you look at science in the right way, you see that it's saying much the same thing. And so this was the natural tendency for people to start with this idea of personifying nature, because these things seem to have control over them. The weather obviously has a lot of control over us, as we're experiencing in LA. We have these hot, dry winds, and fires get started, and it's very difficult to deal with them. And we'd love to have some rain, but then if you get too much rain, then you get the floods. And if you don't get enough rain, your crops don't grow. And so we've always been dependent on the forces of nature for our survival. And so it's naturally to appeal to those forces of nature to help us survive. It's the nature of a genetic organism, is that it's programmed to survive. And the reason it's programmed to survive is because it has survived. We've all descended from people that managed to survive long enough to procreate. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. And so that gets programmed into your genes. The genes that weren't programmed to survive died out. It's quite simple. So we're all programmed to be survivors in this world. And so we are eager to be able to understand these forces of nature, and if they seem to be beyond our control, then we try to appease them or in some way influence them. And this was the idea behind all the various sacrifices, not just Vedic sacrifices, but it was, again, the typical idea throughout the world, really, is to, in order to control nature, we will make sacrifices. And this usually took the form of doing something in fire, because the smoke went up into the heavens where people would think that the deities resided, since a lot of this stuff seems to be up there. We got the sun and the moon and the planets and the rain and the thunder and all these things are up in the sky. So the deities must be residing up there, and so we're going to make sacrifices to try to influence these deities. And so we're going to put them into a fire and let the fire take the offering up to the gods, and hopefully they'll do what we want them to. You know, it's interesting. I read one place where that in the early Vedic society, men represented the transcendent principle and women represented the immanent principle. So women were in their natural state in some way because they were in their manifested form. But the men had to make all these rituals and sacrifices because they're not in their natural form. They're really, they're supposed to be transcended, and here they are manifest in a body. So they're the ones that had to do all these rites and rituals. And so, whereas it seemed to end up being that the women weren't supposed to do all these Vedic sacrifices, there is some hint that perhaps it's because the women didn't need to do any Vedic sacrifices. It wasn't that they couldn't. That's the way it ended up being. That they were not privileged to do it. But in the beginning, it was they didn't have to. All right. So God is always giving His message. Oh yeah, sorry, didn't start this section yet. All right. So we're in the next section. 33 million gods. You know, there's this idea in India that when they had 33 million people there, that everybody had their own god. So that number kind of got stuck into the history books. Were those who wrote down the Vedas incarnations of God? They had realized God, and he who has realized God is the same as God himself. They were the embodiment of purity, and so they were able to perceive all truth. It is because God has given his message once for all and does not need to repeat it that there are no such rishis, seers. Oh, is it because God has given his message once and does not need to repeat it that there are no such rishis or seers today? God is always giving his message, but now there is no one to hear it. We are all like walls. Does any man talk to a dead wall? So God does not talk to us because we are filled with impurity and tamas, or heaviness. But let this dead wall become living, and at once God will speak to it. The life that sages lived in those days in their hermitages was very wonderful. These hermitages were in the most hidden nooks of the forest. They were large villages, perhaps 1,000 souls, and those who lived in them were all so wonderful that sometimes the little children were Atmagyanis, knowers of the self. They had no anxiety as regards food, for 1/6 of the king's revenue was always set apart for the maintenance of these people, and it was paid not in money, but in kind. So they were able to devote all their time to deep meditation. The wives were as great sages as their husbands. The young people were allowed simple enjoyments, but the life was very strict, and each had his or her fixed duties to perform. Their wants, however, were very few. When one of these sages came to a court, the king would at once come down from his throne, take the dust-stained mendicant and place him on it, and then sit at his feet to learn. Such was the great reverence that they had for their sages. What is the difference between the rishis who had realized God and an incarnation of God? The rishis were incarnations of purity. They were sannyasins, those who had renounced everything for the sake of truth, and they preached renunciation to everyone. But when an incarnation comes, he recognizes that very few are fit to become sannyasins, so he preaches the householder's life to a householder, and out of 1,000 householders, he may make perhaps 2 sannyasins. He has, I think that's probably an overstatement. But anyway, he has the power to see what kind of life each man is fit to live. These divine teachers are living examples of truth, and to attain truth, we must sit at their feet. And of course, we have the recent examples of Sri Ramakrishna and Sri Sarada Devi as incarnations of the masculine and feminine principles. And we see that they, in some sense, appeared to be normal mortals, but every once in a while, especially with Holy Mother, she would kind of reveal herself. With Ramakrishna, he went into ecstatic states so often that he revealed himself a little bit more often. And yet, when you read the accounts of the direct disciples, such as Ramakrishna here, they will frequently say that that thought didn't enter their mind that much, that he was just this embodiment of love and wisdom, and they just enjoyed being at his feet and listening to his words of wisdom. And so it wasn't like they were all saying, oh, there's an incarnation of God over here, let's go here. But afterwards, of course, they realized that if this was exactly what happened. And same thing with Sri Sarada Devi. If you will study all the personal religions, you will find that they all preach renunciation. Renunciation is their fundamental teachings. Christ says, give up all and follow me. Muhammad says, Allah is the one God, and you must worship him alone. Buddha says, give up all desires. That is the only way to salvation. Zoroaster says, renounce Ahriman, the principle of evil, for Ahura Mazda, the principle of good. This is the whole theme of the Upanishads. You must renounce to attain freedom. All Vedanta is built on this principle of renunciation. The Vedas are not mere poetic imaginations. They represent the actual experience of the rishis, who merely wrote down what they themselves had seen. The Upanishads are the most wonderful books. One should learn Sanskrit merely in order to study them. They are a concise statement of all the great truths of the universe. Every line is the expression of a mind that has realized. In the West, they preach to masses of people, and that is what is understood as religion there. But in India, one man whispers one or two words in the ear of another in a solitary place, and this is religion according to the Hindus. Man receives religion through the mantram. The spiritual power is transmitted through the sacred word, and this must be made known to none. The wife must not tell it to the husband, or the husband to the wife. It is the person's individual property. So religion in India is altogether an individual thing. It is for this reason that Swami Vivekananda says there must be as many religions as there are people. This is literally true. As one coat cannot fit both you and me, so one form of God cannot suit all. In the West, they give one God and expect him to suit everyone. But in India, every man is given the aspect of God fitted to his peculiar need. That is the meaning of the 33 million gods about which you hear, and it is the guru or spiritual teacher who determines what aspect of God is specially suited to the disciple. So, when you look at, again, the religions all over the world, you find that people describe God looking something like them. And even with something like visions of the Virgin Mary, and of course they don't have the same idea of the Virgin Mary that we have of Holy Mother, but just because their concept is different doesn't mean that she's not a representation of the divine feminine. when she appears in some sort of form that relates to the culture. And so you see depictions of her from around the world, and it looks like the culture that the person's in. So it's natural for us all to picture God and for God to come to us in a form that we're going to understand. He's not going to come with some peculiar alien look that we don't understand at all. It comes as something we can relate to. And so, similarly, although we're all human beings with two eyes and a nose in the middle and a mouth underneath, as Humpty Dumpty said, the ethnic details of the way a deity will manifest is pretty clear. And so the various religions of the world all have their own conceptions. Interesting, he didn't mention Taoism. In there, it's kind of the balance of those two energies, the good and the evil, or the dark and the light, or the yin and the yang, or whatever you want to call it. And it's a realization that they both come from the one, which is also a very Vedantic principle. So it's not always termed as rejecting evil and going towards the good. That's like Ramakrishna's example of the two thorns, where you take the thorn of good and pluck out the thorn of evil, and then you throw them both away. And in this other concept, you realize that they're both coming from the same source, just as the two thorns came from the same rose bush. So it kind of goes a step further. All right, Guru and God. There was a comedian who pretended to be a Swami. He called himself Swami Beyondananda. And he said, "What's the meaning of Guru?" And he says, "Gee, you are you." So that was his idea of what Guru was. So, Guru and God. God being infinite and infinity being absolutely one without a second, there cannot be more than one God. The souls of all other living beings, Jivatmans, all throughout the creation, must have to be finite. And as such, none of them, whether celestial, terrestrial, or infernal, can have the power to know and explain God. For how can the finite ever know the infinite? The infinite mind, having no power to fathom the infinite mind, the finite mind having no power to fathom the infinite mind, it is not possible for any created being to know the ways of God. And basically, spiritual experience, you're transcending the mind. You have to use the mind to get there, but you're using the mind to transcend the mind, because the knowledge of God is beyond our senses and our mind. Infinity is a strange thing. Even though you say in mathematics you might think you understand infinity, when you begin to look at it, it begins to look stranger and stranger. And the first idea of infinity is the counting numbers. The counting numbers go on forever. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you can keep going and going and going, and there's no end to them. And so you think, well, that's what infinity is like. But then you think, well, there are positive and negative numbers, so you could go in either direction. But it turns out those are both the same size mathematically. If you look at the size of sets, you can show mathematically that those sets are the same size. And then you say, well, how about fractions? We'll add put all the fractions in there. Turns out that set's the same size as the counting numbers. But if you go to the real numbers between 0 and 1, that's uncountably infinite. It's bigger than any of those other sets. You cannot pair the counting numbers with the real numbers between 0 and 1. And then you can form other crazy sets of sets. You could take the set of all numbers between 0 and 1, and then the set of all sets, possible sets of the numbers between 0 and 1, and then you can get bigger than that. You can go from, you can take all the real numbers, positive and negative numbers, and you can throw in imaginary numbers. So you can get all these different sizes of infinity, and you see that we can't even have a good grasp of infinity with a mathematical model. It spirals out of control. Compared to infinity, the finite quantity, however big it may be, must be infinitesimally small or zero, as the former must be infinite times bigger. Should be infinitely times bigger than the latter. So compared to God, all souls, celestial, terrestrial, or infernal, are perfectly insignificant, and as such, they are absolutely under his control. Thus the souls, not being free and not knowing to guide themselves on account of the limited nature of their minds, should be guided by God, their omnipotent and omniscient master, if they want to get rid of death and countless woes and their highest wisdom, if they want to get rid of their death and countless woes. And their highest wisdom should consist in allowing themselves to be guided by God and not by themselves. So, of course, we're virtually all at the stage where we don't recognize our true nature, which is always free. But so until then, we are best to think that there is this higher power, God, that is guiding us, and appeal to that higher God. And of course, Swami Vivekananda would often tell people to think you are free, and free you will be. So he encouraged people to take that jnani path, you could say, where you simply keep affirming your true nature. All right, that's not an easy path, however. But how to know the mind of the Lord? The souls have no power to know it, as we have already seen. Hence God's infinite love has revealed a part of himself in the Vedas and the different scriptures of the different nations of the world, such as the Bible, the Quran, the Zendavesta, etc. Obedience to the Vedas and the scriptures constitutes the different dharmas or religions of the world. He who is obedient to God is thus called a dharmika, or religious. Since God must have to be his own interpreter, when men misunderstand the scriptures and thus misbehave, he must have to incarnate himself in order to establish, or perhaps re-establish, we could say, religion. And this is, of course, the idea of the incarnations as set out in the Bhagavad Gita. These incarnations are the gurus, or the true teachers of the world, and being the manifested embodiments of God, by obeying and worshiping them, we obey and worship God himself. The scriptures can be rightly explained only by these gurus, or visible gods. Thus, God only can lead a man to God, and no one else. And so that's the idea of the reverence for the guru and for spiritual teachers in general, is that you try to understand them as manifestations of the embodiment of God, and so they become the spokesperson for God in some way that we can understand. When God feels the necessity to incarnate himself, he comes down, avatarana, to our level to be accessible to us, and hence an incarnation is called an avatara. As long as he stays with us here, he conquers all the enemies of the good and the right-minded people by the power of his irresistible personality and infinite wisdom, and establishes religion once again on the adamantine basis of truth. Before he leaves this earth and rises up to his own infinite glory, he imparts his illuminating power to his disciples, wherewith they become the true gurus or teachers of humanity. These gurus again in their turn impart their guru power to their disciples, who thus become the gurus of humanity, and thus imparting the guru power goes on from generation to generation until it has become very much attenuated and is not able to cope with the rising powers of irreligion on all sides. Then God again incarnates to establish religion, and this is going on throughout eternity. Of course, that's sort of like the in Christianity, it would be the succession of the the popes are supposed to be the representatives of the disciples from passed down from history. So it's really the same idea, except that rather than having many gurus and spiritual teachers, they've kind of solidified it into one person. The Mormons have a kind of a similar idea with their president in some sense. The president is the one that is supposed to be able to communicate with God through prayer and then communicate that to the congregation. From what has been said above, it is clear, I guess they have the same idea about the leaders of Islam too, right? And then of course they argue about which one is the true one. Not an unfamiliar problem. From what has been said, it is clear that the Guru is the same as God. He is the visible and tangible God indispensably necessary for the salvation of man, as God only can lead a man to God, and no one else. So gurus must not be confounded with Mahatmas, who are but highly evolved souls, and are, as such, blind and imperfect. How can the blind ever lead the blind? Guru has been defined in the scriptures not only to be the creator, preserver, and destroyer of the universe, but also the one absolute being beyond space, time, and causation. So by obeying and worshiping the Guru, we obey and worship God himself. Guru is not an intermediate being, distinct and separate from God, but God himself, graciously assuming a human form for the salvation of man. The Sri Ramakrishna mission, therefore, teaches the indispensable necessity of a guru on the part of one who wants to realize salvation in this life, and in so doing, it only confirms the truth that God only can lead man to God and no one else. And of course, the saying is that religion is caught, not taught, and that's again the succession of the guru power, the succession of gurus departing that power through the mantra. The power of the mantra is the vehicle for transmitting that particular power. In India, the followers of the religion eternal, Hinduism, therefore invariably have gurus to take them to God. Every Hindu family has a guru who imparts in secret the soul-saving instructions, usually consisting of one or more holy names of the Lord, to each grown-up member of the family when he or she is found to be eligible for it, with due religious ceremonies to make it more impressive to the disciple. The particular member who gets the instructions and thus becomes a disciple is enjoined to repeat it within himself or herself with a whole soul devotion in a solitary place each morning, noon, and evening, after having purified the body either by washing or bathing. If the disciple can afford to increase the number of repetitions, he or she will thereby approach the ideal nearer and nearer, and will thus be able to reach the goal sooner. So, I've forgotten what I was. Oh yes, rituals. Rituals are really very important because they're sort of concretized truths. In other words, we reenact various things physically rather than doing them simply mentally or verbally, but going through some ritual so that the physical is actually joined with what it is you're doing. So that's why the idea of ritual bathing and that type of thing are very common. I mean, certainly was Jesus went through that same process himself. And Native Americans will go through like vision quests or something of that nature. Young people in the tribes, whether it's a medicine woman or a medicine man, they'll go through some sort of ceremony or ritual where their power is awakened in them, and it's a whole process. And of course, sometimes the physical process is really a necessary part to allow the mind to access those deeper parts of themselves so that they can become the vehicle of truth for the tribe. So this is very common among medicine men and medicine women in those types of cultures. And ceremonies are very important for all of us. You know, even just the simple thing of a graduation. People that were kind of denied a ceremony during COVID, you know, it's just a little different. You never quite feel like you finished. There's when you haven't ceremonially finished. People that just get a marriage license and don't have the whole ceremony of a religion. It just doesn't feel quite the same. And so ceremonies are very important to kind of ingrain the whole process in our being. When most of these gurus of the various families misbehave and so lose the reverence of their disciples, then the time comes to usher into the world another incarnation of God. In this rationalistic age, men of culture in every civilized community have grown less and less credulous and hence they have begun to question the saving powers of these teachers, most of whom have lost their spiritual nature and degenerated themselves into carnality and corruption. How can they, who were too weak to stand the onslaught of sensuality, themselves ever have any power to save others? Those who fall a prey to all sorts of temptations are too worthless and abominable to be of any help to others. Thus, looking down upon them who represent religion, they have begun to lose all faith in the religion itself. And that is why we find amongst the educated population of the world rank disbelief and irreverence, nay, even atheism. These men are ready to obliterate even the least trace of religion, which they regard as a bundle of superstitions, and the sooner it is destroyed, the better for all humanity, they think. And this is something that I tend to see, and even among the religious Hindus that I meet at the colleges and so forth, it doesn't seem like this idea of a family guru is all that prevalent. If I ask people if they have a family deity or something, I don't usually end up with very many positive answers. And if I ask how many have received a mantra, I don't get very many positive answers. So they still think of themselves as religious. They may have a practice, say, of repeating various Vedic chants and prayers, or reading the Bhagavad Gita, or reciting the Gayatri Mantra, or doing yoga in addition to the Gayatri Mantra, sun salutations and that type of thing. But I haven't found a great deal of numbers of people that are being initiated by family gurus into a family deity. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's kind of the impression I'm getting. In India, after the introduction of Western education, complaints were raised against the existing system of Hindu religion. The so-called educated Hindus began to regard the various ceremonies in connection with their religion to be superstitions, and they wanted to have a religion devoid of all these. And the results were various reform movements, such as Brahmanism, Arya Samaj, and the family preceptors lost their hold upon the educated. although a few of the latter and almost all illiterate men stuck to them. The few educated persons who still entertain great reverence for their gurus say, "What though the ways of our gurus are bad? We do not want them, but the instructions of which they are the medium." That sentence didn't quite make sense. Let me read it again. "What though the ways of our gurus be bad? We do not want them, but the instructions of which they are the medium." That's the essence of that sentence. These instructions flow directly from the throne of God, and hence have the power to lead us to him meaning God. Such persons are always infused with faith and reverence, and it is these that help them mostly in deriving the highest benefit from the teachings of such gurus, by enabling them to overlook all the shortcomings of the latter. But such men are very few, and the generality of men nowadays demands purity and spirituality from a teacher under whom they are to place themselves. And since they are not found in most teachers, they have been leading lives without any religion, or instead of worshiping God, they are worshiping themselves and one another. There's a quote here, "This world and this life are all in all. There is no afterlife, no God to whom we are going to be responsible for what we do. Let us eat, drink, and be merry as much as we can. We should treat others kindly, as we want kindness from them. Society is our God, as we get all help from it, and not from any invisible deity. Faith in such an invisible deity being is sheer nonsense and rank superstition. We shall have none of it." That's end quote. So that's the attitude of these people that have sort of thrown out the traditional religion. That's sort of the danger of a little bit of knowledge. You get a little bit of knowledge, or you hear a different viewpoint, and since you don't have the ability to reconcile those different viewpoints, the way Sri Ramakrishna and Vivekananda did, then you figure, well, either just one of them's right or none of them are right, and it became very popular to think that none of them were right. This is how they have disposed of God and religion, and hence, according to his own promise, the Lord of the universe has incarnated himself as Sri Ramakrishna for all nations and all religions. The time needed him, and he could not remain indifferent to the call of his many children who ardently prayed to him for help, not knowing what to accept and what to reject. And so, indeed, we're blessed that we have a relatively recent incarnation that could speak in terms that were understandable to the people of this generation, even though it's been about a century and a half. It's still, his words are much more relatable than, say, Buddha or Jesus, even though their words are still precious as well. But they're harder to relate sometimes to the modern world. All right, that concludes our session for this evening. And let's see, we have, we'll meet again next Friday, and then after that there'll be Swami Brahmananda Puja. And so you're all invited to that as well. That will be on Sunday. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Filled with Brahman are the things we see. Filled with Brahman are the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is. From Brahman all, yet is it still the same. Om, peace, peace, peace. All right, so till next time. Till we meet.